Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought.
All right, so today we are going to talk about agricultural protection by the government. So I'm Levi Russell, and I have Levi Breederland on here with me. And we're going to talk about kind of the sort of the general concept of agricultural protection at the beginning here, and then I'll talk about the U.S. aspect a little bit, and Levi being Canadian and having some agricultural experience of his own, we'll talk about kind of the Canadian system, or at least the parts that he's most familiar with. So just to talk about my background a little bit on this. So I did not grow up on a farm. I grew up out in a rural area that we used to have a family farm there. It was a very, very old house until I was about 10. Then we moved into town, to a small town. But I have been for the last, from 2013 to 2018, I was a professor in an agricultural economics department. Well, for a while at Texas A&M and for a while at the University of Georgia. And I spent a lot of time with farmers. So it wasn't like I just was in the classroom and then doing, research that nobody reads, even though nobody reads my research. That is also true. But most of my time was spent talking to farmers about markets and like where prices were going and all that sort of thing. So I did have kind of maybe, I don't know, you call it an advisory or a consulting role as an economist. And so I ran into a lot of policy issues. I taught a policy course at the University of Georgia for 2 years to undergraduates. So I have some, fairly advanced knowledge of agricultural policy and how it works. And I guess, Levi, do you want to give your sort of background and credentials, and then I'll kind of come back with a little bit of a description of kind of what the problem we're talking about here.
Sure. So I am totally not qualified to talk about anything in the way you are. But that being said, I grew up on a farm, though we never called it a farm. My dad had 10 acres under glass of peppers, which many people will react to that and say, wow, that's a big greenhouse. And it was like, no, that's about the smallest you could have and still be a successful business.
Right. We're talking about like a production type greenhouse, not like the greenhouse you might have, if you just live in, North Dakota or something and you want to have like a little greenhouse for yourself. Like we're talking about
this is like a commercial production. Right. I think about 30 staff working full-time or more.
Wow. That's pretty big, man. I mean, as a business goes, 30 people. I mean, that's a pretty good sized business,
It definitely, like, it was a business, not just a little hobby. When I was a kid, my dad was just the general manager and part owner, and then he eventually bought out the other owners to be like the head honcho. And so I was always, involved in what was going on, and he was always telling me stuff and whatnot. So not exactly like farming as the majority of farming in North America goes, but he's still connected with especially the plant growing side of farming and whatnot.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm sure there's unique challenges with a greenhouse, and some challenges he didn't have to deal with as much as a row crop farmer. But I mean, if you want to grow peppers, in the tundra, you got to have a greenhouse, right? It's not Louisiana.
Yeah. And the greenhouse gives you lots of benefits, and you have a bit more control over your climate. But then the downside is you have to, manually water everything, which is a lot of work when you have 10 acres of plants.
And a lot of money. Yeah.
Yeah. So my dad was always, he was very into the business side of things. Like he was always involved in business related stuff outside of the actual growing process. And so he was always the kind of person, like, if he noticed his kids who were homeschooled were interested in something, he would say like, oh, do you want to learn more about that? So I would always, listen. And it wasn't like farming was never my interest. Like, I think my brother inherited that. But yeah, like I've grown up in the agriculture industry and seen kind of at least part of how that works. And then in recent years, my father-in-law also works in agriculture. He works in the fertilizer sales industry here in Alberta, where
yeah.
So he's working with, farmers with hundreds to thousands of acres, and yeah, like real traditional, what you think of when you see a farm.
Right.
That's what he works with. So
like wheat and canola oil and stuff like that.
Yeah. Lots of the colder, shorter winter crops.
Yep.
Or shorter summer crops. Yeah, like canola is a big one here.
Yeah. So I think maybe it would be good to talk a little bit about agriculture. The reason, I think agriculture is interesting is because pretty much everywhere in the developed world and to an extent in the developing world, there is a lot of protection kind of policies for agriculture. So not only is there a lot of kind of tariff and quota related stuff that kind of protects the domestic market from competition from outside, and there's tons of politics and stuff that goes into all of that, but there's also a lot of subsidy programs that you don't have for other industries, and explicit subsidy programs for agriculture in a lot of countries that you don't have in other industries. And what I think in general is interesting about this, and I've seen some survey work on this issue, because as an economist, most of the economics field would say, this is inefficient. Why are you subsidizing these people? Why can't you just, get your food from somewhere else? And I think what that misses is that people want to have a stable source of food. And I mean, it's a sort of an innate thing. It's like, okay, yeah, sure, we can get our pencils and computers and stuff like that from somewhere else, but when it comes down to a basic need, I'm going to get it here if I can. And one of the books I want to recommend on this is Economics for Helen by Hilary Belloc. Just read the 2 chapters on international trade. It's really interesting stuff, and he gives some reasons why Britain is kind of weird. Maybe we'll talk about that later, but the thing is, like, people want to have a stable source of food, and so they want to get it domestically. And if that means some quote unquote inefficiencies with tariffs and quotas and subsidies, then so be it. They don't, it's like, yeah, tell me all day long that it's inefficient. I don't care. I want to have my food, stable. And so that's a big reason why people vote for politicians who will do, agricultural protection. Now, when it gets into things like ethanol and stuff like that, then it's a little bit less clear. Then it's more about sort of regional competition and stuff like that. Like the Midwest here in the U.S. grows a ton of corn, and so of course they have a huge interest in protecting the that ethanol. Ethanol is just an alcohol, or is an alcohol that's added to your gasoline, and it's made mainly from corn in the U.S. And it's really hard on lawnmower engines, but thankfully here in Kansas I can get non-ethanol fuel. But anyway, so you see some of these like niche issues, but I think more broadly speaking, people want to protect their food supply. And the second thing too is there is also a sizable number of people who like to protect agriculture because they see that as a way of life that's worth preserving. And so maybe we'll get into this later, but 120 years ago, a whole lot more people were agricultural producers, in some commercial fashion, right? So they would provide for themselves, and then they would sell some of their extra, on the open market. And maybe, 40-50% of the people in North America were farmers. And now it's more like, 1.5% of people that work kind of directly in agriculture. And obviously there's a lot of other things in support industries, like your father-in-law that sells chemicals, or people that work for equipment manufacturers and stuff like that. There's more of that now, but it's definitely a little bit different. And it seems when people look at, well, you have this whole department, in your government for agriculture. Why? That's sort of silly. It's 1% of the population. But I think those are kind of the reasons why people want agricultural protection, even if it's not efficient. And so maybe I think will be interesting is kind of talk a little bit about the specifics of how that sort of plays out in these different countries. And maybe we can get to a discussion a little bit of, okay, does this efficiency problem become so big that it, this particular set of policies is too extreme. It's so inefficient that, we need to dial that back, and it ends up just being a handout. And so we can talk a little bit about that. So Levi, I know you said your dad operated, a 10-acre greenhouse. So what kind of interactions do you recall with him having with sort of, subsidy policies or tariff stuff like that? Do you remember any discussions he had about that, or do you know anything about those things?
From what I'm aware, the various subsidies and whatnot, and they call it supply management here, is more focused on things like chicken and eggs and milk, kind of the staple, the more staple food sources, as opposed to, peppers, where half the year they're being imported from California and Mexico anyway. So it's not so much of like it needs to be a local thing. But we do have, there is stuff that the government is doing that causes these prices to fluctuate and change. Like, so for my dad's greenhouse, the harvest season was basically from April to end of November, which, so there's a fair amount of time where, you're not harvesting, and that's also your most expensive time because you're buying new plants every year. So it's interesting to see, like, the way, like, if you just go to the grocery store, kind of the way the prices change throughout the year, like, between, December and April, everything's coming in from the States or from Mexico.
Right.
And it's all, lower quality and whatnot, because it's been trucked up here. But then the moment the local greenhouses come on the market, the prices all jump around, and you have, competing products that are, cheap and old versus expensive and new. And then the recent changes with carbon taxes here have made that very interesting as well, because now your cost of production in Canada is, another notch higher. But when it comes to subsidies, it's more of the farming, kind of the less advanced, less technical type of, like, when it's like dairy production and whatnot, where we have different things that the government does to like almost like insurance. Like the government is setting up systems where if your production fails for some reason, or you have an issue with your crop, that there's funding for you, so that the farmers are at least staying afloat and not going out of business and that kind of thing, which, it makes sense.
Yeah. So that's kind of an interesting one, I think, because that's, I would say, fairly general, that most countries have some kind of a program like that. And, it's always funny how it's billed, right? It's billed as, well, we're making sure farmers stay in business. But, the reality is, if the farmers were just a lot bigger, right, then they could sort of self-insure, right? I mean, a very large operation wouldn't have to worry about, hail in one part of their production, and then maybe a tornado over here and a frost here. If their land was big enough, then they wouldn't have to worry about that stuff, because they would have enough production in other good places where, the revenue would even out. I mean, and that's pretty much what the government's banking on by providing that insurance that way.
Yeah. There's one interesting thing here in Alberta is there's these groups of people, they're called Hutterites, and they're they're a branch of the Anabaptist tradition, similar in many ways to the Amish, except they aren't as anti-technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so they have what they call colonies here and there, scattered around town or around the province. And the way they're set up is basically everybody is an employee, and they all get provided housing, and they all live like in their own homes on the property, but the property is owned by the company. And then the company owns, a couple thousand acres. So they have a very diverse set of crops, and they're not, just doing pigs or something. They're doing, pigs and cows and dairy and chicken, and then all the farming as well. And they're producing their own feed for all the animals. And in many ways, they're kind of like the perfect example of an efficient farm, because they do everything, and their staff is all housed on site and can work, all hours of the night. Like when it's harvest season, they're working 24/7.
Yeah.
Because they have the people to do it. And it seems like they've got like, that seems like it might be the way to go, is like kind of get bigger and get more efficient.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, maybe the thing that holds them back a little bit on efficiency is the fact that they're not specialized in a relatively narrow type of production. I mean, I think that could be something where they would quote unquote improve, but of course, from their standpoint, that wouldn't be an improvement, right? Because then they would have to go, maybe they would produce tons of grain, but then they'd have to go buy their meat. Well, they don't
exactly. Yeah, they keep as much in-house as possible, basically.
Right. So I think what's interesting about Canada is its notorious dairy policy. And I've heard that like people in, like, say, British Columbia will actually drive to Washington State and like buy milk and then hide it in their car and basically traffic it back to Canada, because it's so much cheaper in the US. So a gallon of milk here, and y'all use liters, so whatever.
Actually, we sell our milk in gallons too.
Really? You do? Okay. Because I'm looking at an article that's talking about the price in liters, but that's good. You live in Alberta, maybe they're using the.
I think in Eastern Canada they sell their milk in 1 liter bags. It's very dumb.
That's weird.
Here we have gallons, like gallon jugs. They look the same. They say 3.78 liters or whatever it is, but they are a gallon jug.
Right. So here, milk, I don't know, $2.50 a gallon, something like that. And there it's probably $4 probably for a gallon of milk, I'm guessing.
Yeah, something like that. I'm looking to see if I've got a note here of that. But yeah, like,
neither of us shop for our houses, so but the thing about Canada is,
as a kid, like our farm was let's see, like 4 kilometers from the US Canada border.
Oh, okay.
Close enough that we could see 4th of July fireworks on the other side.
Right.
And there was a dairy farm the same distance the other direction
from
that had a farm store. And so especially when I was younger, we would drive across, and we'd buy our milk and our cheese, and I think we bought eggs, but especially the dairy products were cheaper, as well as gas. So we would buy stuff and then truck it back. And there was limits of like how much you could bring in without having to pay extra duty.
Yeah, so because they didn't want you actually trafficking the stuff.
Yeah. My mom would say like, oh, you and your brother and sister should come along, because then I have 4 people worth of import,
right?
Rather than just one. So we would do that, and it kind of feels
what I think is interesting about this is like, so it doesn't make sense that there would just be this magical difference in the price of milk, across this border. But the reason for it is because in Canada, they are very restrictive about the number of people who can produce milk there. And they don't have like massive, sort of trade controls and stuff like that, that raise the prices there. And so I think I looked this up quite a while ago when I was looking at dairy stuff in Georgia when I was there. And in Canada, you have to pay for a license, and it's like $300,000 just to become a dairy operator.
Yeah.
And so they get to decide if you're a dairy operator and all this stuff. And
Yeah, so they're artificially creating a scarcity in that way. Like they're saying
exactly.
like there's a limit. I think it's I wrote it down somewhere. It's something like 80 million hectoliters per year is the max of milk that can be produced.
So yeah, even if you are a dairy farmer, you have a maximum production level too.
Yeah.
I think this is an interesting juxtaposition here. In Canada, there's a sort of a bright line between some of these, industries within the agriculture sector are treated. On the crop side, maybe reasonable stuff, right? Well, we want to have enough canola and enough wheat produced here to, feed our population and, to trade with other countries and stuff like that to get the things we want. And so it makes sense, like you were saying before, to, support farmers and keep them in business. But then on the dairy side, it's so extreme, it's so intense that it's like now you're harming people, right? So like, you could have a thriving, healthy dairy industry with only a set of policies that sort of supported those dairy farmers, and not something that restricted entry into the industry and restricted how much they could produce and all of this nonsense. And I would say in the US, we used to have a lot more of that kind of thing, especially in like fruits and berries and stuff like that, and nuts. But a lot of that has kind of gone away, and it's a lot more market oriented here. And obviously in the US, and this is something Hillary Belloc talks about in that book, Economics for Helen. The US, and this is, this book was written 100 years ago, but he's talking about how, the United States could, not trade with anyone, and it could produce everything that it needed within its own borders, because it's such a, we have such a massive country. And I think Canada would be similar. I mean, unless you wanted pineapples or something, right? Not that we could produce pineapples here, I don't think, but the UK, I mean, good grief, they produce, at the figures in his book 100 years ago was something like 20% of the beef that they eat, they produce there. So, what he says in the book is they're sort of forced to trade with other countries. So I think that's kind of an interesting way to think about it, that, trade policy and subsidy policies and stuff like this can be dependent on the country that you're in.
Yeah. And here in Canada, it was near the end of the 1800s, the government put into place a subsidy for grain transportation.
Oh, really?
Specifically, so it was basically the government would subsidize the cost of shipping grain to encourage the farmers in the prairie provinces to send their products back to the east rather than to sell it to the neighbors to the south. And so we had that was in place until 1995.
Wow. And
then in 1995 they repealed that, and suddenly it became more profitable to sell to Americans.
I see.
And that would, it's interesting, like if you take everything into account, you're reducing the amount of government revenue because of less sales in the country means less taxes being collected and all that. So
right,
it was interesting, and the justification for that was that Canada we're such a big country east to west, where our population kind of spread out in this long thin line, that they wanted to encourage people to send stuff horizontally across the map rather than to ship it to the south, because there's nothing like Edmonton it doesn't look like northern Canada on the map, but 97% of Canadians live south of Edmonton, so there's nothing north of here, so you're really sending.
Well, yeah, I mean, northern Canada is like, you're dead in 10 minutes if you're outside for more than whatever, like
yeah.
The Yukon.
Well, we've got like this history of some really strong subsidies, and that was part of the push to get people to move out to the prairies. Was they had homestead land where you could get 160 acres for free, and then knowing that you had some guaranteed price on your production,
right?
It was good encouragement to get people to move out here.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's a lot there, but I think this fits into some of what's in those international trade chapters in Economics for Helen, and what I like about it is there's a great example that's probably going to be tough to convey over audio, but it's really neat to go through the example, and he has a little chart to help you. But basically, it's kind of an example like you were saying with that subsidy for wheat transportation. So could we say, right, that in a global sense, that it was less efficient to subsidize those farmers in Canada to ship their grain east to, Toronto and places like that, than to just trade it with the U.S. and then, maybe the prices of that food would come up in Toronto, but maybe that means that people in Toronto pay a little bit more for their food, but then they get other stuff from the U.S. cheaper, right? Because there's more trade. And it's like, okay, sure, but the question is, do you want the food to be more expensive in Toronto? Like, that specific question needs answered, right?
Yeah.
And so maybe you get, I don't know what the heck Canada imports from the U.S. I don't know, lumber. I don't know. So, the lumber's a little bit cheaper, but, the food's more expensive. And it's like, sorry, man, like, I'd rather have the houses be, a tiny fraction more expensive than it'd be harder for people to buy bread,
Yeah.
And so
food is such a high priority in, like,
sure.
Once you've got a place to rest your head, the next thing you're thinking about is what's for supper. So,
right. And maybe lumber being more expensive would make it more expensive to get a house, but there's other ways of of dealing with that issue than for instance, you can use some other kind of building material that you produce in Canada to build a house, but you can't substitute food for not food. So
so according to this random article that I have no idea if it's accurate or not, Canada is the United States' main supplier of wood, actually.
Oh, okay. So it's the other way around.
So it's the other way around. Apparently, the largest U.S. export to Canada is car related. So either full size cars or parts and whatnot. So
yeah, and I would say probably, cars, because we don't even make cars here. We assemble them. We buy sub assemblies from Central and South America and then assemble them here. So, but that makes sense, yeah. So, okay. So cars are a little more expensive, but that's transportation. That's a lot less important for you than food is. Right. So, well, so I think that's a kind of a good framework for understanding this, that there certainly are things that go way too far, but there's also some sensibility to a lot of this. And so one of the examples I wanted to talk about here in the U.S., in the U.S. is kind of unique, right? We have pretty much, any kind of agriculture you can imagine, it happens here in the U.S. somewhere. So fruits and vegetables in California and the Southeast, tons and tons of meat production, quite a bit of dairy production. Obviously, here in the state of Kansas, where I live, I think we have like 6 to 7 million head of cattle here. And we're the second or third state. I think it's Texas, Nebraska, Kansas. So, there's just a lot of production that goes on here. And so it was always interesting to talk to people because, they would be confused about some of the international trade stuff. These farmers would be like, well, why are we shipping meat to other countries? Like, don't we want our meat here to be cheaper? And it's like, okay, man, like we're shipping stuff we don't want to eat. Do you eat a lot of liver and cow brains and stuff like that? No, you don't. But people in other countries will take it. And so we ship it to them, and then we, bring other stuff here. So, the U.S. is kind of an interesting case study, I think, because you get these really interesting little sort of industry relationships. And so I'm actually working on a paper right now talking about peanuts and how the peanut industry in the U.S. works. And so about 20 years ago, some programs ended that were that were a lot like your dairy policy. So in the tobacco and peanut industries, so two industries that are kind of held mostly in the South, the Southern U.S., the Southeast especially. Those two products were, you were guaranteed a higher price if you produced a quota, right? So we had a quota of production, not a quota of trade, trade, but a production quota. And if you produced, if you had an agreement where you were under the quota, then you got a much higher price than people who just grew peanuts for fun, or
I see,
without the quota, right? And so there was this weird system, right, where basically you kind of you had to be a quota producer. And they got rid of that, but what they did for peanuts and tobacco was they gave them these sort of transitional payments that would continue for a few more years to kind of let them wind their business down or whatever, right? Because you could see that obviously if the quota is effective, then a lot more people would want to grow tobacco than they previously did, right? If you take away the quota system. So on the peanut side, it was kind of interesting where these transitional payments kind of stuck around. And so we're 20 years after this program ended, and peanut producers still get like super preferential treatment on a whole range of these different programs. And so, like, for instance, there's a payment limit. There's a limit on your income that you can, once you get above a certain income level for your farm, you can't get any more payments above that income level, right? So here's the funny thing. There's that general limit, and then there's another equivalent limit for just peanut payments. So if you're a peanut farmer in the South, you can basically get twice as much in terms of payments than any farmer anywhere else in the country.
Wow.
Or even than your neighbors if they don't grow peanuts. And so to me, it's just insane, how like this tiny little industry has been able to get this weird favor. And, of course, the standard public choice thing is, the benefits from that policy are concentrated in a small group of people. And so they have a massive incentive to maintain that program, even though everyone else would be better off if we got rid of it. But the problem is, even if you ate a lot of peanuts, right? How much is it going to save you if you cut off this peanut program, right? How much is that going to save you on your taxes? Not much, right? So as an individual citizen who's just paying taxes have almost no incentive whatsoever because the cost of the program is so widely dispersed.
Oh yeah.
And so I think it goes from a political angle. It goes from being something that makes sense that we want to preserve agriculture and preserve our capacity to produce our food, like maybe crop insurance or some of these payment programs and stuff like that in general, to something that's just obviously corporate welfare, right? It's just obviously a handout, to a politically powerful small group of people. And I think, one of the biggest things I've been pushing, over the last 5 years or so is this idea of a PR problem. And I think agriculture, at least in the US, I don't know. Good grief. Canada with that dairy thing, man, those guys have to be under a ton of pressure.
Yeah.
To get rid of that because, that is, because once this stuff goes public, right, and once people get enraged about it, and here in the U.S., every 5 years they change the agricultural policy, right? They have to pass a new, what we call a farm bill. So, every 5 years this becomes a relevant political issue. And all the other time it's not. But then whenever people are arguing about it, it's like it gets worse and worse, and they have to push the programs more and more market oriented. And less of guarantee and stuff like this, because I think they have a PR problem. Because people don't see this as preserving a way of life and preserving our capacity to produce our food. It's just a handout.
Yeah, especially when it's the things like the peanut thing that's kind of a holdout from a previous system, and it's just
right.
It's just like it feels like it's there to be abused almost.
Yeah, and we have even weirder stuff. Like, for instance, we have these things called marketing orders where basically a, and this happens especially with stuff like, nuts and stuff like that in California. So there will be, the California Almond Board. And so, around harvest time, the California Almond Board will sort of estimate how much production there was. And then they will tell all of the farmers, okay, you have to destroy this percentage of your crop so we can keep the prices up.
Wow.
And literally they'll either just give it away for free into like the livestock feed system, right? So they'll keep it out of the food supply so that the grade almonds are, the price stays high, or they'll just dump it in the ocean.
That's crazy.
And I don't know if they still do that, but definitely within the last 2 decades, that has been a thing. And it's just such an odd, it just takes it too far. And I think if people knew more about the difference, that I think you can draw this line between, legitimate support policies and whether they're trade related policies, like for instance, here in the U.S., we've had a sugar tariff for, I don't even know how long. And it even props up, very inefficient sugar production from sugar beets in places like Minnesota. Most sugar comes from cane, right? Yeah. Sugar cane that's grown where it's really hot. And so we have some sugar cane production here in like Florida and southern Texas, and maybe in California. But otherwise, we would have to import a lot of sugar, right? A lot more than we do. But we have a sugar tariff. And so everybody in the U.S. pays more for sugar. And, we get a lot of our sugar from high fructose corn syrup, right? A lot of our sweetener anyway.
Oh, yeah.
But it's just one of these things where, okay, maybe that sugar tariff makes sense. Okay, yes, in a very limited sort of, libertarian sense, it doesn't make sense because it's just a restriction on the trade between, people in 2 locations. But, maybe that's okay if, it preserves our ability to produce, sugar in Minnesota. So we always make sure we have some sugar that wouldn't otherwise be profitable. And so, like I said, I think you can kind of draw this distinction. And I think what people need is they need a little bit more information about what types of products have these different kinds of programs. And so that's why I'm writing this paper on peanuts. Another case I think that's interesting is that, people are becoming more and more aware of sort of, where their food comes from and what their food is like. And, people talk about chemicals and genetically modified stuff. And another project I'm going to be working on here soon is we're going to be looking at regulations that actually hamper people from having sort of smaller, more local kinds of production. Because, this is another way to deal with risk, right? Is to just have, to not have such a large centralized system, right? So, for example, cattle in the U.S. is a very interesting case of this. So you have the mama cows are kind of dispersed around the country. And then when their calves grow to a certain weight, they pretty much all get sent to a very small area in the U.S., Nebraska, Kansas, and northern Texas. And that's where they are fed in feedlots, and then they're sent to slaughterhouses around that area, and then they go to grocery stores all over the country. And so because they have that centralizing step, right, where everything has to come to the middle of the country, it creates potential problems, right? So, I mean, if something happens to one of these large facilities, the price of meat might come up. But if you have local production, at least that you're going to be able to have that product there. And sure, maybe it's more expensive all the time, but maybe you're getting higher quality. Maybe you have a little bit more, and this is something I've talked about a lot on this podcast, is, that commerce builds community. And so maybe it's a good thing for you to have that commerce for your food a little bit more locally. But there are all kinds of regulations that get in the way of this, obviously, right? So we go back to The Jungle, this book that was written about 100 years ago. It was a fictional book, but it really caused a stir because people thought that, there's no meat inspection and nobody knows, what's actually going on in these slaughterhouses and stuff. And that wasn't the case, but it pushed a surge of regulation. And now, it's very hard to have a relatively small, slaughter facility because, regulation creates economies of scale, right? And so then you need a bigger operation to justify, to be able to turn a profit, just from complying with these regulations. There's a great book called "Everything I Want to Do Is Illegal" by Joel Salatin, and he's a farmer in Virginia who very much loves the sort of kind of produce everything on your farm and don't specialize perspective.
Okay.
And this book is just full of examples of ways that the government was basically getting in the way of him, producing local food and even building. He couldn't even build his own house because Virginia's codes were, he couldn't build a small dwelling on his own property with his own wood. So, or at least he couldn't do it very, very effectively. So, I'm going to link to that too, but in the show notes, because I just love that book. It's absolutely hilarious. But I think in general, the regulatory and policy aspects of agriculture are interesting in that I think I think too often we talk about it as this one thing, right? Agricultural protection or agricultural regulation. And the problem is we really need to start differentiating between programs. And I think the more we're able to kind of inject sort of, localist or, kind of nationalist perspective. I know those are kind of two separate things, but I guess on the regulation side, more localist and in terms of, understanding the effects and the efficiency of policy, more of a nationalist perspective. Then I think that will actually help people understand why we have these things and not be so concerned about these quote unquote efficiency problems, in terms of international trade.
Yeah, it'd be good to, like, for someone who is they're against the idea of any government subsidy, to at least understand that there's a difference between, limiting how much milk you're allowed to produce versus like an insurance program.
Right.
Like there's very different things there, different benefits and different downsides to each.
Right. And the fact that a dollar is not a dollar, right? Sometimes it makes sense for, one thing to be a little bit less efficient or to be a little bit more expensive if it's in service to a more important cause, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that people need to keep in mind too.
If governments and other organizations that are connected to all that also do a good job of kind of showing the trail that the money's following, and you can see like, okay, there's a benefit to me not being able to sell my stuff to the States, for example, right, because in the end that money does come back to me in the form of XYZ or Z for you Americans. If they make it very easy to see the benefits and the peace of mind and the stability that you can get from a program, that's a good way to encourage people to not be against it.
Well, and what also plays into that is that, the farmers in Alberta need to have some kind of, sort of mutual fellow feeling, to use an Adam Smith term and really trigger libertarians. They need to have some mutual fellow feeling with the people in Toronto and, God forbid, Quebec. I don't know. As Canadians, right? So then it makes sense. Okay, well, maybe I have to ship my stuff over to Toronto, but I care about people in Toronto because they are my countrymen.
Right?
They are closer to me than somebody in Montana or wherever. And I think that there's until maybe 20 years ago, this was perfectly acceptable to talk about. Now all of a sudden, you're a murdering Nazi if you think that being Canadian is a good thing or something like that. And that's not just Canada. I'm not picking on Canada. I pick on Canada all the time, but in this case, I'm not picking on Canada. I'm saying, the U.S. is the same way.
Yeah, the national pride and that kind of thing is definitely changed.
And it has nothing to do with Hitler, right? It has nothing to do with slavery. It's just, people in my country matter more to me than people outside my country, just like people in my town or people in my family. I mean, there's different levels here, but the point is it's the same kind of thing, right? And commerce is a piece of our relationships.
Right.
So I think that's probably a good place to stop. And, we'd love to have any questions or requests for more on this type of thing. And I guess, the best way to contact us is via Twitter, the Trad Dad's website. Or you can email me. It's tradeconomist@gmail.com. Love to have suggestions through there as well. And so, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.
The podcast you just heard was made using Anchor. Ever thought about making your own podcast? Anchor makes it really easy for anyone to get started. It's a one-stop shop for recording, hosting, and distributing podcasts. Best of all, it's 100% free. Sign up now at anchor.fm/new. That's anchor.fm/new to get started.